Today we'll be looking at John chapter 13, verses 18 through 30. It's the story of Jesus in the upper room with his disciples. They were celebrating the Passover feast together, and Jesus is troubled, surrounded by the men who had been with him for the last 3 years, the men who had heard him teach, who had walked with him and talked with him along the way, who had witnessed his miracles, who had the benefit of having Jesus explain to him after he had taught the crowds, what did you mean when you said? The guys who ought to be the guys who get it, gathered in a room, and Jesus says in verse 21, after he'd said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread in the dish, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. What you're about to do quickly. There are details to this story, and they all matter because you might be thinking of Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of the Last Supper, and as iconic as that picture is, it's not historically accurate. What you would have expected to have seen is probably a U-shaped table with Jesus at the head of the table and the disciples reclining around, leaning on their left elbow probably so that their right hand was available to feed themselves. So we already know from this account that John was on one side of Jesus, and scholars infer that Judas must have been on the other side of Jesus, because he speaks with Judas in Matthew chapter 26 verse 25. Judas says, surely not I. And Jesus' reply is, it is as you say. Now, if the other disciples had heard that because Jesus was talking to the guy 4 people over, there would have been a very different scenario painted in the gospel account. But we know from John chapter 13 that when Satan entered Judas, he got up and left, and they just assumed that he was going out to buy bread or supplies or give something to the poor. They didn't know what was going on. Now, why is this important? Why is it important that at the Last Supper, where Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, that Judas was right beside him? You see, the places beside the master of the banquet were places of honor. And you don't just get there, you're invited to those positions. And I think it's interesting, it wasn't that Jesus just got word that Judas was going to be the one to betray him. He knew what was going on. And yet said to Judas, don't just be with me, don't just be around me. I'd like to have you beside me. That's significant as we contemplate the meaning of the cross and its significance for us as individuals. In the middle of our mess, Jesus knows there's sin in my future, and yet I'm invited to be at the celebration. I'm invited to be at his side, to be known and loved, and given every opportunity to respond to truth and grace. And as we move closer toward Resurrection Sunday, I'd like to challenge you to recognize that even though you're fully known, your past and your future, Jesus says, you're loved. Come be right beside me.